The last round of talks between corps commanders of both sides was on August the 2nd. China has continued to build up even since those talks, with major force increases in the Pangong sector as well as in North Ladakh's Depsang. Despite committing to de-escalation at the last round of talks, the Chinese army has moved artillery brigades, tank regiments and troop columns into both zones, revealing its tried and tested intent of posturing for peace during talks, but keeping its war machines moving non-stop in the most provocative manner. While India has never underestimated an adversary, and history holds many lessons with China, experts on both sides agree that the dynamic of initiative has changed. It is precisely because the Indian army hasn't bent over to Chinese actions, hasn't resigned itself to Chinese movements, and counteracted Chinese aggressions that the PLA finds itself in a situation alien to it in the Indian context. But as the defense minister himself said, not once but twice this week, India is a force for peace. The ball for talks may be in China's court, but this is India's turf. Bureau Report, India Today. And we've got some very relevant breaking news coming in here on India Today. We're hearing that the two corps commanders of the Indian and Chinese armies could hold their talks within the next 2 to 3 days. It could be over the weekend, it could be on Monday. That's what we're hearing. That's what government sources here in India are telling us. We'll let you know if the Chinese have confirmed on dates, but it hasn't happened so far. But now those talks might be happening within the next 2 to 3 days. The agenda and issues to be raised by the Indian side in the meeting were discussed and finalized during a high-level meeting held by Defence Minister Rajnath Singh along with the Chiefs of Defence Staff and the National Security Advisor. Obviously, disengagement and de-escalation will be the big focus. I want to bring in India Today's defence editor Abhishek Bhalla, who's at Ground Zero in Ladakh with this breaking story. Abhishek, it's been 8 days today since talks were agreed upon by both sides, but dates have not been confirmed, by the Chinese side. Now we're hearing those talks might happen in the next 2 to 3 days. What are you hearing?
That's right, Shiv. Dates not fixed, not scheduled yet, but it's likely very, very soon. That's what I've heard. And there was a meeting today, earlier in the day, in New Delhi, where the security brass got together, not just to review the situation at the line of actual control. There have been many such deliberations over the last few months, but also to focus on what the strategy will be when it comes to talks, when it comes to negotiations with the Chinese in these military talks that are likely very soon. Remember, things have changed over the last 20 days. There has been a lot of posturing from the Chinese side, yes, aggressive maneuvers to take over some of the crucial heights that the Indian army has been deploying. So that's the reason why the scenario is completely different from the time the corps commanders met last time. This will be the 6th time that they will be meeting. Of course, the focus and agenda from the Indian side is going to be disengagement, status quo ante as of April end. But let's see how things pan out.
Let's see how things pan out. Lots of uncertainties still remain, including which precise day these talks will be held and whether this new development has come on the back of the Chinese committing to a date. That is not clear just yet, but there are indications that these talks could happen within the next 2 to 3 days. It will be still 10 days after those talks were actually agreed upon. Abhishek, thank you very much for getting us that update from Ladakh. Joining me now to discuss why there has been this delay in talks that were agreed upon as far back as September the 10th. It's been 8 days since the talks were actually agreed upon, and they still haven't happened. Why haven't they happened? We've got some, theories of our own about why there has been this possible prevarication by China, but I want to get an expert's view. We have with us today, very honored to have Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, former Chief of Staff of the Leh Corps. He's also a Shaurya Chakra winner and one of the first persons on Siachen as part of Operation Meghdoot in 1984. So he knows all about dominating heights, holding heights and operating at those high altitudes. Also privileged to have Andrew K.P. Leung. He's a China strategist and commentator. He joins us live from Hong Kong. Thank you, Andrew. And welcoming also Jaidev Ranade, former Additional Secretary with the Research and Analysis Wing, which is India's external intelligence agency. Gentlemen, thank you for being with me. General Kulkarni, kicking it off with you. How do you see this delay, sir? You know, 10 days back is when the two sides had agreed that the corps commanders would meet for a sixth time urgently to try and de-escalate the situation. There have been incidents of firing that have happened since then, but there appears to be a prominent delay from the Chinese side in reverting with dates for these talks.
Shiv, you're absolutely right. You know, the Chinese, firstly, as everyone knows that they can't be trusted, probing has now gone well to a amount of coercion. I said they've stopped probing now. They are only posturing and not probing anymore, at least for the last 10 days. After 29th and the 30th of August, they have seen that India is in a position of strength. Having seen that, now they realize that even in Taiwan, with the Undersecretary's visit, they're under pressure at that front. So it is so much better that you keep delaying over here. It doesn't really matter. Just focus and concentrate over there and to see what Taiwan does with USA over there. Now the USA's Undersecretary's visit should finish in the next about 2 days. After that, you will find that now they will offer for talks. Next week, we'll have the corps commanders talk. So since China is on the back foot, they are unable to see what they can do about it. They know Eastern Ladakh, LAC is no longer an LAC. It's become border. So there's more ambiguity. And let us see how we go about it. They must be thinking with the Indians. Because even in Finger 4, Finger 8, all these areas, the more concern now is the Depsang Plain. That's where we are going to see that the Chinese are at least pushed back. You know, this kind of a thing which they're trying to posture around in Depsang is something we really need to be, we must take care of that particular feature. And at no point of time, the guard must be down. We must be vigilant. You cannot trust the Chinese chef. You just cannot trust them at all because they would keep you busy in talks and do something at another front. Unbelievable, a front which you would have never thought of. They would have opened something unnecessarily. So Chinese are capable of putting pressure, but since we are in strength everywhere, they know that military posturing alone they can do on their side. Probing is almost prohibited for the time being. It will, I hope that during the talks, something worthwhile emerges, but at least 5 rounds of talks have not resulted in anything worthwhile.
One thing is absolutely certain, gentlemen, which is that, you know, no matter what the talks do or do not achieve, the Indian military is staying completely prepared. Andrew Leung, you know, trust is at an all-time low. You know, that is something that is beyond dispute. But there are theories about why the Chinese side would clearly delay talks that it has committed to almost 10 days ago. Why do you think this has happened? Because on this side, the view is obfuscation, prevarication, you know, perhaps some kind of miscalculation, India achieving certain strengths in the last few weeks, etc., etc. What's your view?
Well, first of all, I think we have got to come to the reality that the whole issue, these conflicts, cannot be resolved through military means because both are nuclear powered. And even though you gain certain tactical advantage on the ground, it doesn't mean that that's the end of the problem, because the other side will defend their own interests, or both sides would defend their own interests with all their might. So I don't think that the military kind of talks is the end of the problem. And in fact, before this military commanders meet, the stage is set by some broad agreements at the highest level in both countries.
Foreign Ministry.
And the so-called 5 points already agreed. Now, why the delay? I would necessarily call it a delay because if you are involved in this kind of situation, both commanders would have to assess the situation on the ground. As pointed out in earlier interviews, the Indian side have seized certain heights. It doesn't mean that China cannot seize other heights, but as I said, that the military tactics cannot solve the problem.
So I think Andrew, that apologize for interrupting you, but this delay is not mutual. The delay in these talks is not mutual. The delay in the talks is not mutual. These were agreed upon by both sides. It is China which has failed to come back with a date for these talks. India has been prepared for these talks. There is a clear delay by China. 10 days is not a small period of time when you've got troops barely 100, 200, 300 meters away from each other, tanks and artillery facing each other. 10 days is an eternity.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that it's the Indian side which chose to seize certain heights, right? So that changed the dynamics on the ground.
Yeah.
And then the Chinese commander has got to assess the situation. So that's point number one before they fully prepare for these military talks. The second point is that I think this probably Chinese side feels that time could be on their side because the winter's coming. It doesn't mean that they want to delay until winter, but then the assessment has been that on the Indian side, even the armor, some of the tanks are not well suited to operations in cold weather, and so that it translates into the kind of negotiation advantage on one side or the other. So that may have been the assessment.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. You're saying that China is possibly delaying the talks for some kind of tactical advantage on the ground.
Well, I'm not saying that that's necessarily the reason, because I started off by saying that the military commanders got to be prepared.
I understand that. I understand that. But you know, after a 5-month standoff, Andrew, surely you can't be suggesting that the military commanders on the ground are not prepared already, because these co-commanders have already had 5 rounds of talks. Let me bring Jaydev Ranade in as well on this. Mr. Ranade, how do you read this delay in, holding talks that have been committed to by both sides at a time, when the situation is on the proverbial razor's edge between the militaries of two sides?
Well, you're quite right that the situation is extremely tense on the border with so many troops massed against each other. But let me make 3 quick points.
Yes.
Firstly, right at the beginning, when this entire operation had started from the Chinese side, I sort of said that it's going to be a protracted standoff and it's going to be a long haul. And I think the Chinese are trying to do precisely that. They're dragging their feet and trying to also delay any kind of decision. Second, I'll just mention a couple of points which will show how they're trying to introduce uncertainty and keep tensions high during this period. For example, you'd recall that, or you'd be aware that in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, they are having an air raid alert practice tomorrow.
Yeah.
Now, this is a very unusual situation. It hasn't happened for many, many years. Last was in 2009. And for them to do this at this point, obviously there is a message there. It certainly does heighten tensions a little more.
Absolutely.
The second are continuous reports every day, in fact, about armor being moved in, about training being conducted bang on the border, about more troops being brought in. These are not calculated to ease tensions. In fact, they're intended to, in fact, add to the uncertainty that is already very high and in the border. The third, I think they're trying to build up a kind of consensus and mood within China also for a possible conflict. But fourth, and the most important, I think Xi Jinping, all said and done, did not anticipate the rapidity with which we built up our forces to counter them. And probably now weighing his options, whether he will suffer more damage if he goes ahead and launches an operation and gets a bloody nose, or whether he could withdraw and then face the consequences at home. I think both unpalatable choices for him, but he's probably weighing his options there. So I think these are a combination of factors which have led to this.
Okay, so we've got Jaydev Ranade, stay with me. We've got graphics on our screen that will play out in just a moment, showing you, making it very clear how China talks. There are talks that happen, there are various rounds of talks that happen, and then we've listed the actions that have been taken thereafter. And it paints a pretty clear picture of why trust is so low. Because talks are one aspect of it, and then there are actions on the ground which are a parallel aspect of it, which go completely against the spirit of those talks. For instance, most recently, after the last round of talks, I'd like to tell you, gentlemen, on August the 2nd, there were major generals who spoke on both sides in the Daulat Beg Oldie sector, and just a few days later, an entire fresh artillery brigade was moved into the Depsang sector. So, there are various other examples of this kind as well. General Kulkarni, would you like to add to or respond to Andrew Leung, who says that one of the possible reasons for the delays is that military commanders are preparing for the changes that have happened on the ground?
No, not at all. The changes aren't something which the Chinese aren't prepared for. They know exactly where the Indians are. Those heights that the Indians are occupying is indicative that they are on the back foot. Now, there's nothing that they can do. But Chinese are known for it. Shiv, if you go back even 2013, the Prime Minister is visiting, and they did that at Depsang. In 2014, the President, she is visiting, they did that at Chuma. 2017 at Doklam. So they are known for all these kind of, creating unnecessarily tensions along the border or everywhere else to put pressure on India. The aim is to put pressure on India, nothing else, but it is to ensure and be able to convey to India, stay away from the United States of America. We are your neighbors. Just toe our line. That's the final thing that the Chinese are looking at it. And that's not possible. We are not looking at America. We are not even getting pressurized from China. And that is what is irking Xi Jinping. What is all this? What kind of resolve does this nation, India, have? And he had probably underestimated the resolve that the Indians had. It was at the border, whether it's on economic front, whether it was on political front, whether it is diplomatic front. We seem to be gaining strength. And also, the world over, the democracies have got together. Okay. You see, US, Japan, Australia, India, France, Germany, everyone has got together. Even in Southeast Asia, if you have Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, all of them have started showing their eyes to China. So this is what is now bothering Xi Jinping. He's looking for an honourable exit.
Andrew Leung,
there is problem.
Yeah, Andrew Leung, respond to that. This is not a question asked with any degree of chest thumping by any measure. It's a straight question. Is there a degree of miscalculation, by the PLA or the Chinese, that has sort of offset their designs or their calculations of what they wanted to achieve? One of them could be resolve from the Indian army, something that they were not used to before. The other could be preemptive actions that have been taken, in the last few weeks. Is there a measure of the Chinese being caught off guard, and that's why they're having to course correct now?
Well, your latter remark is more correct than the first. In the sense that it was the Indian side who seized the initiative to seize some of these heights, and that changed the dynamics on the ground.
Yes, it did.
And of course, the commanders would have to reassess their own positions. But let's make it quite clear that the commanders on both sides are not allowed to have a free hand. They are the tail that cannot be allowed to wag the dog.
Right.
The dog is the big picture. I mean, they're dictated by the highest leaders in both countries. So I think that as both countries have decided on a kind of easing the situation, I don't think the commanders on both sides are allowed to unravel the situation. So I think that this talks is both commanders are preparing for these talks, and I think that they're preparing. The China side may take a little bit of time to reassess the situation and to allow for some build-up of their own strength, not to attack, but then to increase their chips, their bargaining chips, perhaps.
No, the Indian side definitely has more bargaining chips. I mean, that's the least that one can say about how the dynamic has changed since August the 29th. Jaydev Ranade, yes, trust is at an all-time low. Yes, the relations have been severely damaged as far as, faith in talks is concerned. There is no question that the Indian military is prepared in every way for any eventuality and is not looking at the result of talks to take its own initiatives, as has been demonstrated since August the 29th. But what should the Indian government and the military be looking forward to from these talks when they happen? And we're hearing they could happen the next 2-3 days now.
Well, I'll just take you back a couple of steps before I address your question.
Yes.
The first is, how did this entire situation arise? It arose because the Chinese forces suddenly appeared on our I may say. We didn't trigger the entire situation, but we were presented with it. So that is the first thing we should not lose sight of.
Yeah.
Second, when there were the talks at the defense minister level and at the foreign ministers level, particularly between the two foreign ministers, you will recall that a joint press communique was issued, a joint press statement. And almost simultaneous with that, the Chinese foreign ministry issued a statement which contained some other points not included in this joint press statement. So that is a departure. That is a breach of, I would say, faith. What happened.
Very true.
So that is an instance of deception. And I wouldn't call it, that trust is at all-time low. I would call it absent trust at the moment. That's how things are. Now, as far as these talks are concerned, I frankly am pessimistic as to what's going to come. Because the way I look at it is, this force build-up on the Chinese side, the advances that the Chinese made could not have happened without the express approval of the Central Military Commission and the chairman of the Central Military Commission. Now, he is the only one who will have to take the decision, which is what I said. Xi Jinping is weighing his options. He'll have to take the decision as to how the talks should move forward, whether they should move forward, and whether there should be any kind of resolution which allows a pullback.
Is that going to happen, General Kulkarni? I'm going to come to you in just a moment, because I want to talk about, if there is going to be no faith whatsoever in these talks, then, what can one look forward to as the next step? Is the next logical step going to be some kind of limited conflict, possibly a localized war even in that particular area? Is that the inevitable? Before I come to that question, I want to show our viewers also, because there's a great degree of interest in India's military preparedness on the ground. India is leaving nothing to chance. The talks can happen. India is committed to peace. But on the ground, the Indian army is holding firm. It has mobilized to mirror the Chinese deployments in all of those friction points. And the Indian Air Force too has upped the tempo of its missions over Ladakh. Here's a ground report. Sandeep Unithan visited Ladakh to send us this story. With a roar, a beast returns to base. An Indian Air Force MiG-29 fighter jet arriving back at the Leh Air Base after a mission over Ladakh. The roar of its twin engines, now a signature sound in this stretch of the Himalayas. And here's a Mirage 2000 in a low pass over the Leh airfield before climbing out for its next mission. On the ground, a pair of formidably armed Apache helicopters lifts off. They have their own prowling to do in airspace close to the standoff zone. As winter arrives and Indian Army troops consolidate their positions at dominant heights across the standoff zone, the Indian Air Force is in top gear for both offensive and defensive air operations. Military preparedness in Ladakh has been high for nearly 5 months now. But since the end of August, the tempo of missions has hit a record high. As you can see from these images, the Indian Armed Forces aren't waiting for China to make a move. They're fully prepared for any eventuality. But China's stubborn refusal to confirm dates for an agreed round of military talks has spurred suspense and added to uncertainties in eastern Ladakh. If you're wondering about the recently inducted Indian Air Force Rafale fighters, India today can confirm to you that the jets have been flying periodic missions over Ladakh. The Indian Air Force chief had dropped a major hint about the aircraft's readiness at the induction ceremony in Ambala recently.
They have already flown and familiarized with our operational environment and have undergone intense integrated training with our other combat fleets including firing of advanced weapons. And I expect the golden arrows to intimidate and dominate whenever and wherever employed.
In a scenario unique to the Indian Air Force and representative of its arsenal, air power in Ladakh stands represented by both one of the oldest fighter types in service, the MiG-21, and the newest, the Rafale. Super high altitude, super cold weather, no deterrent to the tempo of air operations.
A clear day over Leh today, but war clouds looming large in Ladakh. Mirage 2000 fighter jets, MiG-29 air superiority fighters and Su-30s have been carrying out a number of sorties. The army is extensively deployed and increasing numbers along the line of actual control to keep an eye on an extremely belligerent and untrustworthy China. Coupled with this is the fact that China appears reluctant to return to the dialogue table. What is the dragon planning? Is there more deceit in store? With Sandeep Unnithan and cameraman Kripal Singh in Leh, Gaurav Sawant for India Today.
So General Kulkarni, coming to you then, you know, the military preparations are on. That doesn't get affected by the trust deficit that's there. There is little or no faith in the talks going forward, even though theoretically India is committed to, you know, a dialogue process to resolve the situation. So this is a bit of a paradox. Are we to believe, is the public to imagine that the next logical step is going to be a violent one? What's your view?
Shiv, before I come to this, a very interesting point struck me. You know, Lord Harding, at that point of time, when the Chinese were making move in Ladakh, around the same time, he used the word, don't worry, I have the coastal of the Chinese to take care of. Imagine, what he's talking about is what the Americans are taking care of in the South China Sea. And Lord Harding said, don't worry about the Ladakh part, we'll handle the Chinese. So that is as way back in 1900, in the earlier 90s. But right now, see, it's absolute tense. There is no denying the fact. It's almost eyeball to eyeball at certain places. But notwithstanding that, confrontation by the Chinese, I don't think, but we should be prepared for it, because if you're ready for war, there won't be a war. But should you not be ready for it, then there's a possibility the way they have amassed their troops all along, there could be a part. But these kind of incidents where the troops are eyeball to eyeball, a small accidental fire. Right now, what you hear of troops, the Chinese troops are fired in the air.
Yes.
Should somebody, by mistake, I'm just saying by mistake, even fire at somebody and hurt, injure, kill somebody, I think the situation just might go out of control, and it just might turn out to be a very, very heavy fighting and a very localized place, which can be anywhere along the border, and that is what we have got to be careful.
And Andrew, that brings me to the question that I asked you initially, you know, and you said it as well. These are two nuclear-armed countries on a hair trigger. The situation could spiral at any time. We've seen bullets fired on 4 occasions, you know, within a span of just a few days earlier this month. Unless these talks actually mean something, it's going to mean war, Andrew.
Well, I think that there is no doubt in my mind that the leaders on both sides have given strict instructions to their military officers not to escalate the situation, because otherwise things will be out of everybody's hands, because escalation has a tendency to move, you know, there's a spiral to move things out of hand. And there will be unintended consequences, as pointed out just now. In case someone misfired and someone got killed, the whole thing could escalate beyond anyone's control. And then, of course, it's not a question of numbers. It's not just a question of tanks. It's not just a question of aircraft. There are missiles. And at the end of the day, if the whole thing escalates, you know, I'd like to point out the fact again, both are nuclear-armed countries. And of course, the China's military is built up its capabilities quite rapidly. So I don't think that both countries want a war, and would try their very best to avoid one. But I think that I believe that this latest news that the talk is going to happen sooner rather than later now, the China's maybe have spent a bit of time preparing for it. For various reasons which you have talked about.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, I think that we're going to have to see some talks. Whether or not it's going to last forever is another story.
Is there going to be some big takeaway, Jaidev Ranade? You've already said that you don't have very much faith in these talks. In that case, what's going to bring this situation to an end? Or do you think it's just going to stretch on and on? These talks are not going to be some big milestone to look forward to.
Well, I think the first achievable kind of milestone would be de-escalation. Don't let things.
Andrew, that question was for Jaidev. For Jaidev Ranade. Yeah.
Okay.
This particular round of talks, when they happen, I think are one round, and that's not going to lead to any conclusion. It might be a stepping stone for the next. But de-escalation or disengagement are a long process. And I think we have to be prepared for a long and harsh winter stay in this terrain. But I do think that at least our leadership has been trying till now very hard to try and look for a peaceful resolution, to try and get that peaceful resolution. They'll probably keep trying. But, it takes two to tango.
We're going to have to see how it goes. It's still an unfolding situation. It's tempting to see the next step as some kind of big resolution, but one must look forward to it, whatever it is. At the end of the day, one can have zero faith in talks. One can be very realistic that these talks might not lead to anything. One can acknowledge that there is zero faith or trust at this time. But the fact that communication lines are still open at the brigade commander level and now at the corps commander level still leaves one small little strand of hope that things can be resolved without a shooting war. And that's the hope. But India remains prepared. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me here on Newstrack tonight. Thank you. Keep watching. On the other side of this very short break, the sandalwood drug scandal in Karnataka has gone.